Hello and thanks for joining me. Today I'm on the Snowdon Ridge path with Darren Knight. Well, now I haven't been out in the mountains for quite a few weeks. We've had all these storms rolling in and it really hasn't been the sort of conditions where you could risk it, to be honest. But Darren's come up all the way from Cambridgeshire, and you may recall the last time I was out with Darren, we went to Nant Gwynant and had a really still, misty morning. We'd intended to do the route we're doing today, that time in November. Well, today we're really lucky. There's been very little rain, there's lots of really interesting and dramatic skies. It's blowing a gale, as you'd expect, but nevertheless, we're really enjoying ourselves. Now, we haven't decided how far up the path we're going to go today. The summit is clouded over, but it is supposed to break up later on, so we'll see what happens. At the moment, we're about halfway up. As I mentioned, we're on the Rhyd path, which is quite an easy path in the lower reaches. So if you're interested in some mountain photography, but you don't think you're capable of getting onto the high peaks, this isn't a bad compromise, because there's some really interesting photography to be had only about a mile or so away from where you're parked. Now, we'd only stopped for a brief coffee break and for Darren to grab a time lapse. But it's quite a common occurrence when you're in the mountains and you stop and have a look, you find a composition even though you hadn't thought there was one. What I like about this particular shot is that there's this boulder in the foreground. It's got these fabulous rusty looking lichens growing on it. It looks superb. Now, there isn't any light. The light is flat and grey, which isn't necessarily a bad thing because it makes the exposure relatively straightforward. Plus, despite the fact the light is flat and grey, we've got some nice texture in the sky. So what I've done is I've done this as a really long, wide shot. I'm shooting at 12mm, but I've got this rock just about 2 feet in front of the camera, and then I'm shooting right across the valley over the forestry at Rhyd to Mynydd Mawr and Agarn on the end of the Nantlle Ridge. So I'm hoping to get some depth into the shot. What I've done is a 3-shot focus stack. I probably don't need all 3 shots, but I focused on the stone, a boulder in the mid-ground, and then the mountain ridge right in the far ground. As I said, 12mm, f5.6. What I have done though, because this wind is quite savage, I've upped my ISO to 640. Last time I was on the mountain, I mentioned that it's worth your while thinking about your ISO when you're out on the mountains, because you're really not going to put much noise into your image, but you're more likely to get a sharp image if you can get a fast shutter speed. So by upping my ISO, I've been able to get a shutter speed of about 1/320, which should be enough to freeze everything. I think we're done for this point now, so we're going to head on further up the mountain and see what else we can see. Now let's take a quick look at those 3 exposures and see what I was able to do with them. So we start off in Lightroom, where the new feature that it has when you import, you can apply a preset automatically. I've always had a preset which allows for the characteristics of my sensor and the raw files it creates. So these slider settings are always applied. So the 3 images are taken over into Photoshop as layers. Now, the blend that I use is always manual, because what happens with Photoshop is when you allow it to focus stack automatically, it usually makes a complete Horlicks of it. You can tell because if you, for example, take your nearest exposure where you focus very close to the lens, very often Photoshop will also be trying to display bits from other parts of that exposure, like the background, and you know that they're not sharp. So Photoshop's botched it. So I always do this manually, so I'll apply my masks and brush them accordingly. Another little trick that I use so that I never have to really think about it too much is I always start a focus stack closest to the camera and move away, so that way I know that with the image numbers I always know which is the closest, which is midground and which is background. Now you could argue I should be able to see that if I look at which is in focus, but sometimes it's marginal. Now the next thing I do is a sharpen layer. In the past you may have seen on previous videos I talked about using frequency separation, but just recently I've been trialing the Topaz Labs Sharpen AI, which actually works really well, and I'm liking the stabilization feature. So I may well stick with that. And then finally, a contrast layer. And the way I'm injecting some contrast into the detail is using dynamic contrast from Color Effects 4, which is one of the NIC filters, or DxO filters as they're now known. Now I set this recipe up ages ago, again like my initial slider settings, because it works really well with the images that my particular camera produces. Yours probably would be different to mine, but well worth experimenting with it. It saves me an awful lot of time. So I've focus stacked, I've sharpened, and I've put a bit of contrast in. We've brought our image back into Lightroom, but it's still looking quite flat. There's not much going on in it. Now the way I get around that is lots and lots of dodging and burning, and I do this on all of my images. So let me just whiz you through to the finished image, and then I'll show you how I arrived at it. So this is the flat starting image, and this is it with all of my dodging and burning applied, and as you can see it's radically different. So let's talk about a few specific things that I've done with this. First off, I haven't cropped very much. I've straightened it up a little bit to get rid of the blank part from the focus stack. But normally I would be looking to crop out most of this right hand side, certainly up to the line of the mountain. And very often probably inside that, almost to a square crop. The reason for that is that all of this area down here really isn't doing very much as far as the image is concerned. But in this instance, I didn't want to cut the lake off here. So where Llyn Cwellyn is down in the valley, it's kind of mirrored on the other side of the image by Llyn y Gada. So I figured I would leave that in. And the way I've dealt with all this area down here that's not doing much is to put a grad filter across it diagonally and darken this corner right down, because I don't really want to pull your eye across into it. Now, what you can see clearly is that there's a much lighter patch running up through the middle, kind of taking you on a journey through the image up to this area back here where the mountains are. The way I've done that is mostly with a series of radial filters. So for example, starting down here, I've brightened up this area under the rock and pulled the shadows so that it's not solid black. When you get to the rock itself, you'll see that this, when you look at the slider, has come up, getting on for about half a stop. Immediately beyond the rock, I've darkened this down, and that's to enhance the contrast between the rock and the grasses immediately behind it. Then brightened up, brightened this up, brightened this up, this central area, and then up here on the mountain, I've brightened this up. I've also warmed it, increased the saturation as well, because that again pulls your eye through to that mountain area at the back. These shoulders of land here and here on the left and right, I've dropped the exposure there by about 1/3 of a stop. And what that does is it creates this light area running right up through the middle of the image and pulls you through to enhance the depth of the image. And that's really what I was going for when I saw this in the field. I thought that rock's quite a strong foreground, but if I'm going to make anything of the image, I need to avoid how flat it is. And this is kind of a lesson in how important it is when you're out with your camera to have an idea of what you're going to do with it when you come back, because that will enable you to make the most of what you're actually doing when you're out and about. And then when you get back in front of your computer, you've kind of got something you know you can work with. So just another quick look at this. That's where we started, that's what we brought back from Photoshop, and that's what we now have as a final image. So I'm quite happy with that one. I didn't expect that it was going to be a jaw-dropping, portfolio-worthy image, but as a record of the day and something that shows what the conditions were like, I'm quite happy with that. And that's the sort of thing that usually will make it into the final cut of my videos. Well, it's turning out to be quite challenging today. We've actually been quite lucky with the conditions insofar as it hasn't rained, but the wind is absolutely savage. Quite a few people coming back down off the summit have said don't bother because it is completely savage up there. And since we're here to take pictures, Darren and I are sort of debating not going on much further. We're currently about 3/4 of the way up, just getting onto the South Ridge, about 750, maybe 800 meters up. So we've got up to a respectable height, but the wind is making things really challenging at the moment. Darren's having all sorts of trouble getting his Canon glass to focus on his Sony body, so he's effing and blinding over there. But yeah, we're still having a good day. Apologies if you can hear anything in the background.
I've done it. Manual focus.
Hooray, manual focus. Well, now as far as photography today, most of what I'm up to is handheld stuff at reasonably high ISO. I've got one or two images that I'm hopeful of might be quite interesting, but what I'll do is I'll take you back to the studio and we'll have a look at them on the computer and see what we can make of them. Now, you've probably gathered already that this video is slightly out of the ordinary because I don't normally do these studio bits where I talk about the images, but I thought I would try it out. And I'd really appreciate it if you let me know what you think, because it occurred to me that I go out and about and I tell you all about the location, I tell you all about my thought processes when I'm gathering images, but the whole second half of that process, which is where I take those raw files and do something with them, usually you don't get to see. Now, a lot of people have written in and said we'd like to see more processing. I don't really want to go into detailed processing because frankly it's a bit tedious moving sliders about, but I am happy to discuss in broad terms what was going on in my head, such as it is, while I was processing images. So if you found that sort of thing useful and you enjoyed that variation to my videos, I'm happy to do it from time to time. Maybe not every single time because it would probably get a bit boring, but certainly now and then to mix things up a bit. Let me know what you think. So with all that said, let's have a look at the last couple of images that I captured while we were out and about up in the hills. Here's the next image that I decided I was going to work on. With this one, what I was concerned about was the flank of Moel Eilio over here and this ridge of Foreground and Bwlch was quite bare, quite blank, nothing much going on, but I really liked the shape of the ridge line. So in order to make something of it, I needed a strong foreground, and I found this boulder that was kind of pointing in the right direction. What I also did was I used this boulder to hide the flank of the mountain, and you'll see as I bring the camera down lower and lower to the ground, this boulder comes up and fills that space nicely. And this is a really good example of where if you simply stand and have your camera at eye level, sometimes you're going to miss out on what could be a better composition. And very quickly, my final image of the day. This is the raw file with just the basic adjustments. and looking up here, using these rocks to take your eye up to the summit of Snowdon. This is as high as we got. This is about 800 meters up. With that composition in mind, I always had it that it would be a square crop. I was definitely going to lose this bit of rock here in the bottom corner, and then this area here was going to be brought back in as well. What I've done with this is I've really brightened up this foreground ridge here and these stones to pull you through. And then this area behind them on the flank of the mountain, I've darkened that down considerably to emphasize the line between the foreground and the background and make sure there's plenty of depth in the image. Anyway, that was it. We weren't able to do any more filming up on the hill. We packed up and scuttled down, didn't stop again on the way down because it was pretty hard work, but absolutely brilliant fun. Thank you ever so much to Darren for coming along. Always enjoy his company. And if you haven't, you really must check out his channel because he's a good filmmaker and a great photographer. I'm going to leave it there for this one. Thank you ever so much for watching. Really appreciate it. And I would appreciate your feedback on this kind of format where we look at the images in more detail. So if you haven't done it yet, why not subscribe now and join me next time. Cheers.